Sup, guys? All good things must end. The streak ends at 8-1 with a loss yesterday on Sonny Gray and the St. Louis Cardinals. Both starting pitchers in that game had similar stat lines as far as like hits allowed, walks allowed. Gray, I believe, just gave up more runs, and the game was just out of reach. St. Louis's offense certainly didn't help at all. Gray didn't pitch as badly as the stat line might make you think as far as the amount of runs that he allowed. He didn't pitch as badly as that, but still wasn't good. We move on to today. We got a full baseball card today, and obviously because it's Tuesday, you're going to have more teams that didn't play yesterday, so you have more teams that are crossing over into new series. That is the case here. We do have some situations where teams are returning home from road trips. One of them is Philadelphia. They are returning from the West Coast and a Western road trip that took them to LA to the Dodgers and then the Diamondbacks. And they didn't do that well on the road trip. They went 3-4, losing the last three to the Diamondbacks after beating the Dodgers in that series. So I do think Philadelphia is in kind of a bad spot here. They're up against Miami, who suck, but Miami is going out on the road and only having to travel within the East Coast. Both teams are off yesterday, so the travel is a bit better for Miami. But, of course, Philadelphia obviously has the better team in a lot of ways, the much better offense. But Miami does have Valente Beozo pitching. Beozo is pitching. And he's been pretty good so far in his rookie season, going at least 5 innings in all of his starts so far and allowing 0 or 2 earned runs in 3 out of the 4 to give himself a 3.05 ERA, 1.02 whip, and a 19-5 strikeout walk ratio in 20 2/3, 16 hits allowed. So he's been off to the races. He's been pitching pretty well, aside from one start against Boston where he gave up 5 earned runs, but he did have an 8-1 strikeout walk ratio on that one. He's actually been walking more guys since the start of August, since he was out of the rotation for a little while, but those starts were still not that bad, and they were against Atlanta and Cincinnati. Atlanta can definitely hit. Cincinnati not horrible at hitting either. So he's been pretty good, and Philadelphia has not seen him before. So you might be thinking, well, then why aren't you playing Miami here? Well, I think it's a little bit dangerous because Miami can't hit. And I would look at this and say, well, Taijuan Walker is pitching for Philadelphia. So I do think Miami actually has the starting pitching edge here because they have the better young pitcher who is unfamiliar to the opposing hitters. And when a pitcher is a good young pitcher who is unfamiliar to the opposing hitters, as I harp on this channel all the time, I think I say it every day during baseball season, those hitters have to take a couple of times against that pitcher to kind of adjust to what he's doing. So that tends to be a little bit of an edge to the pitcher early on. So that does look good for Beozo. Taijuan Walker on the other side has really bad stats this season, a 5.6 ERA and 1.49 whip. That's not good. I mean, his career stats are certainly better than that, but he only has 1 season with Philadelphia. He's kind of a journeyman. He hasn't stuck with a team, and that's just because his stats have been pretty mediocre. His whip has been bad for a bunch of different seasons recently. He had a couple decent seasons with the Mets, actually, before going to Philly. Those were maybe his best seasons, at least whip-wise. His stats are actually pretty good those 2 seasons, still with too many walks. But since coming to Philadelphia, he's taken another step back. Last year, his whip was way too high. Didn't have a good strikeout rate last year, and his walk rate was way too high last year. His strikeout walk ratio was terrible last year. And this year, that's kind of continued. This whip being almost 1.5. He's allowed more hits than innings pitched. His strikeout walk ratio is terrible again with a 43-21 strikeout walk ratio in 53 innings, 58 hits allowed. None of that is good for Walker, and he did face Miami once, so Miami has seen him this year, but that was one of his better starts, where he only gave up 1 earned run in 6 innings pitched, 4-1 strikeout walk ratio, but gave up 8 hits to that weak offense. And then if you look at Walker overall, so Walker, well, I should say he is coming off the DL. He has been hurt. He hasn't pitched since late June, so he's been out for over a month. So with a veteran pitcher like him, like I said with Musgrove yesterday, and he actually didn't do too badly, although they didn't go that deep into the game. So sometimes you see these guys coming back from injury on a little bit of a leash, a short leash, I should say, where they come out of the game a little bit early. They're on like a pitch count. But they do tend to be ready to go. These veteran pitchers coming back from injury do tend to put in a decent performance, and they come back and they're a little bit undervalued because you haven't seen them in so long, and the injury kind of factors into the line and whatever. But Walker, I don't know if that's going to be the case, man. His stats against Miami are actually not good. So that's what, or excuse me, they are good. Sorry. His stats overall in the season are not good, is what I meant. So that's why I hesitate. But his stats against Miami, what am I even saying? I am so out of it today. His stats against Miami are good, which is why I hesitate to play Miami here, because otherwise I'd be looking to play Miami because you get Beozo, who is unfamiliar to Phillies hitters, up against Walker, who's had terrible numbers basically since he's been on Philadelphia. But his stats against Miami specifically are good. So that's the one issue, including that one start this year, even though that does mean that Miami did see him once this year. Miami has a 133 batting average off him lifetime and 30 at-bats, only one extra base hit, a home run by Vidal Brujan, and 445 OPS. So those numbers very weak for Miami's offense. That keeps me away from that one a little bit. You do have St. Louis, Cincinnati. I will say there is what looks like legitimate movement. I don't see the market percentages yet on Miami, Philly, which is why I'm not talking about that yet, because it seems like Beozo wasn't announced until pretty recently. St. Louis, Cincinnati is Fetty against Green, and I have seen Cincinnati. It looks like they flipped from a plus 110 underdog at home, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense really, but up to a minus 125 favorite, which makes more sense. 72% of the tickets on Cincinnati, but 81% of the cash. I do agree with Cincinnati. Not enough for me to want to play it. They are pretty public, but I think we are seeing legitimate market movement on the side of Cincinnati as well, with professional agreement seemingly there. You got what looks like seemingly two good pitchers here in Eric Fetty for St. Louis. They brought him over from the Chicago White Sox. So he's now pitching in a new environment up against Hunter Green. But Hunter Green has just been excellent, man. Like, after struggling a little bit to start his career, but having really good like strikeout walk numbers, really good strikeout numbers especially. To me, I was like, this guy's going to be good. He has like really good potential, good strikeout stuff, and he has really turned into a great pitcher this season, at least over the last like month or couple months or so. He's been really a dominant pitcher. He's been Cincinnati's ace by far. So I lean to the Green side there against Fetty, who I think is a bit more questionable. Fetty this season with his numbers on the White Sox, it seemed to be kind of an anomaly based on his stats throughout his career. I mean, he's not a really young guy, and I don't see how he just kind of figures it out and becomes a really good pitcher all of a sudden. I don't really see that being the case. And I think Fetty actually has really bad numbers against Cincinnati, although I don't think it's in a huge sample size. Green has better numbers against St. Louis, although they are a bit more familiar with him because he's in their division. But Green is the better pitcher and has better numbers up against St. Louis. Cincinnati did beat me yesterday, though, as well. So St. Louis might be maybe trying to bounce back from that. I don't know. But most indicators and the starting pitching matchup will put me on Cincinnati there. And I think the bullpen situation is kind of a wash in that one. So that one's close to being a play. And then you do have Detroit is returning home from a West Coast road trip, and Seattle, I believe, is starting a road trip. So both of these teams are having to travel east from the West Coast. But of course, Detroit returning home from a road trip. That's why I'm mentioning these teams: Detroit, Philadelphia. As I mentioned on the show, I feel like I mention this almost every day as well, not even just during baseball season, but teams returning home from road trips, it tends to be a distraction spot because you've been away from home for an extended period of time and you have family life to get back to. You get distracted a little bit and have stuff to take care of at home, and meanwhile you have to get ready for this game. But it's not really one I really want to get involved in because Detroit has their ace, Skubal, pitching. Tarek Skubal, but he's up against George Kirby, who was also a very good pitcher for Seattle. So this is the best pitching matchup of the day. I tend to mention what I think is like the best pitching matchup of the day. And I think last night's probably didn't disappoint with Chris Sale against Blake Snell in that one. I think neither of them even gave up a run in that game. It wound up going to extra innings with Atlanta winning 1-0. So I was wrong about being hesitant as far as an under in that game. That was a completely dead nuts under in that one. That one did turn out to be a pitching duel. I don't expect this one to be exactly that way, but Kirby against Skubal does look like a good pitching matchup to me. So it's not something I really want to get involved in. And I think both of them actually have decent numbers against these opposing hitters as well. Kirby has held Detroit to a 243 batting average, although an OPS in like the 760s. So that's a little bit high. Skubal, who's been the better of the two pitchers, I would say by a bit. He's got a sub-1 whip. He's just been excellent. Against Seattle, what has he got? He's held them to a 197 batting average and 61 at bats and 623 OPS. So I would not play against the returning home team Detroit there with Skubal on the mound. He's just too good, so I'm not going to do that. And then I think there was one other team returning home from a road trip, but I don't even remember. Was it Tampa Bay maybe? No, Tampa and Houston played yesterday, so I don't know what I'm thinking. Could be LA of Anaheim returned from a road trip yesterday. Yeah, I don't know what I'm thinking. I thought there was one other team. Oh, well, there is one other team, and I'm going against them. So let's go to it. Let's get this video done, man. Baltimore at Washington, the natural geographic interleague rival, Baltimore and Washington. I'm going to take Washington here, man, in some form or another, because this is what I think is not a good spot for Baltimore. They had an extended road trip, even though it didn't take them that far geographically. They had a 4-game series against Cleveland, 3-game series up in Toronto, and then down to Florida for a 3-game series against Tampa before now returning home. They do have a day off. Both these teams had yesterday off, but still, that was a long 3-series road trip for Baltimore there, man. So they haven't been home for a while. 13 straight games on the road, and now they're returning home, and they kind of lost whatever winning momentum they had there. They had an okay road trip, but they kind of split the whole road trip, I think. I think they were sub 500 on the road trip now that I'm looking about it. They had 5 wins. So whatever that wound up being, they didn't have a totally successful road trip, but they won the series against Tampa to finish the road trip, but lost the last game, which kind of killed that momentum they had from winning the 2 games against Tampa. Now they're returning home, and again, like I said, that's a distracted spot. Typically, you come home, you have family life to get back to, and are they really going to be focused on this Washington team? I mean, Baltimore, yeah, they are battling for first place in the AL East with the Yankees. That is true, but the Yankees just had an embarrassing loss yesterday, 12-2 to the Chicago White Sox, with Luis Heel not pitching well in that game and Kai Busch somehow getting out of major jams. I don't know how that happened. Kai Busch had one of the weirdest stat lines I've ever seen. I think it was his second start ever, and he went 4 2/3 against the Yankees, walked 7 guys, and allowed 6 hits. That was like a stat line where he probably gave up like 10 earned runs, right? No, he gave up 2 earned runs, even though he put 13 men on base. I don't understand how the Yankees did not capitalize on that. And that was just a hilarious final result, a 12-2 White Sox win. I do expect the Yankees to be much better in this game, but Yankees are just a massive road favorite, so it's not really something I would want to play. The price is just way too high, even though Nestor Cortez does have good numbers against the bad White Sox offense. Jonathan Cannon pitching for the White Sox. I think the Yankees have barely seen him before, if at all, so that's a little bit of an advantage to Cannon to some extent as well. So maybe potentially even look to playing an under there, but it looks like the market's kind of against the under, so I don't know. And Cannon coming off an emotional high, kind of, because he pitched in that game, I believe, where the White Sox finally broke that historic loss streak of 21 games or whatever when they finally beat Oakland. Cannon was the winning pitcher in that game, I believe. So he's maybe coming down off of that, but he still might get up for a game against the Yankees. So I don't know. And Cannon is still a little bit unpredictable, but he hasn't been that bad as a rookie pitcher. So not something I want to get involved in, of course. Back to what I was saying, though. Getting a little sidetracked, all these tangents, man. Baltimore, they are in a battle with the Yankees for first place, but because the Yankees lost so embarrassingly last night while Baltimore was off and fell behind Baltimore again, I think that might put Baltimore in a situation where they're feeling a little bit better about themselves. Oh, the Yankees just lost. We have the lead over them still, the half-game lead. That might have Baltimore being a little bit complacent as well, whereas if they had watched the Yankees win last night, Baltimore might be a little bit more focused on, hey, we have to get this win here. Okay, yeah, sure. As far as the bullpens are concerned, I think both of these teams actually don't have very good bullpens, and they're both rested because neither team played yesterday. So I don't think there's a reason to really go against one team or another based on that. But then you have the starting pitching matchup, which is where I think we actually get an edge playing Washington here. Washington actually has the better starting pitcher here against Baltimore. Washington's getting their best starting pitcher up against probably Baltimore's worst starting pitcher, which is a crazy a crazy find on the baseball card here, where you get a Baltimore team. It's obviously the better team because they have the much better offense. But the starting pitching matchup is about as lopsided as it could possibly get against Baltimore in a battle of these two teams here. Jake Irvin pitching for Washington. His record isn't good, obviously, 8-10 because he doesn't get enough run support, but he's pitching well this season, man. 3.76 ERA, 1.12 whip. That's pretty good. He's got a 119 to 33 strikeout walk ratio, so his walk rate's pretty low. He's allowed 20 home runs, so that's the main concern with him, the long ball. He's got to keep that in check. He's only allowed 123 hits and 139 innings pitched, so he doesn't strike out a ton of guys, but his control is fairly good because he also doesn't walk many guys, and he has not allowed many hits either. So he does get a decent amount of outs, although he has been struggling a bit more since the start of July. I will admit that. He had a couple of bad starts in the month of July, but it was on the road against the Mets and Milwaukee are the two starts where he really got lit up for some runs, and those are tough offenses, man, and both on the road, so I don't take that much away from that. And then he had another bad start facing Milwaukee right again. And in both those situations, in that second game against the Mets, he was coming off a 1-hit 8-inning performance against the Mets in the previous start 5 days before that. So he was due for a regression there where the Mets had just seen him, and the Mets lit him up now that they were familiar with him. So that kind of makes sense to me. And then he had two bad starts against Milwaukee in short succession, a good offense that was familiar with him that second time and did well against him again. So I don't put that much stock into that either. And then his most recent start against San Francisco, I think, looks worse than it was. He did give up 8 hits in 5 innings, and that's not good. He had a 4-to-1 strikeout walk ratio, though, so that's in line with what Irvin does. That's not bad, but he gave up 3 home runs, so that's kind of why his stat line didn't look good. He gave up 5 earned runs there, which it could have been worse. The fact that he put 9 men on base in 5 innings and allowed 3 home runs, you expect that would result in more than 5 runs allowed, but that wasn't the case. He was able to get out of it. So that tells me to some extent he was actually pitching decently in that game. That strikeout walk ratio tells me he actually didn't pitch that badly. The amount of home runs that he allowed kind of skewed the amount of runs that he gave up in that start. So I don't think Irvin is that bad, man. Overall, his stats are good on the season. I think he's due to kind of bounce back from this because he was pitching so well earlier in the season. I don't think he's just completely falling apart here. Even though this is only his second season, he's 27 years old, so he kind of had a late start to his major league career. And last year, he had way too many walks, but he's really gotten that under control this year. That was his problem last year. His strikeout rate was low as well, but he didn't allow that many hits last year. He wasn't that horrible except for the walks last year. His whip was way too high because of the walks, but he seemed to have gotten that under control this season. So I think he is kind of finding himself and becoming a better pitcher than he was in that first season, his rookie season. So I do think he is better than what he looked like last year, and maybe not as good as he has been over the course of much of the season, although I think that is a large enough sample size to say, hey, he has done well enough consistently that I think he actually has found something and he isn't that bad. And that is what I think. And like I said, looking at the bad starts that he's had recently, most of them were kind of in tough situations for the most part or somewhat misleading stat line. So I like it. And facing Baltimore has never faced Jake Irvin before. So Irvin, you got a guy who's pitching decently, young pitcher, and Baltimore's offense has never seen him. So again, I'm going to say I think Irvin has a little bit of an advantage there in a matchup like this where he could keep this offense a little bit at bay just because they haven't seen him before. So they're going to take a couple times through the lineup to actually try to figure him out. Plus, they might be hitting distractedly to some extent because it's the return home spot too. So I kind of like that, actually. I think that might help Irvin in this one. And then on the other side, I think it's clear Irvin is the better of these two pitchers. So on the other side, you have Trevor Rogers is pitching for Baltimore. He's a guy they picked up from Miami at the trade deadline. He wasn't pitching well over the course of the season, man. I don't understand what they really saw in him. He's made 2 starts with Baltimore since they got him. And they were both on the road against good offenses, so fine, you could say that, but he wasn't good in those 2 starts. And you might say, well, it is because he was on the road against 2 good offenses. So those are tough opponents to be facing in a new environment as well. Yeah, that's true. But the fact that Rodgers went from a dead team in Miami to a contender in Baltimore should have had him pumped up, and he still wasn't good. up against Cleveland, who is certainly another contender right now. He had a horrible start, only going 4 1/3, allowing 5 earned runs, 3 walks, 3 strikeouts, 1 home run allowed, 6 hits allowed. Wasn't a good start. It was a bit better for him in the next start against Toronto, but still 7 hits allowed in 5 innings pitched and 2 walks, 2 strikeouts, 2 earned runs allowed, 3 runs. Still not a great start. So he hasn't had the ability to really go deep into games. He hasn't gone more than 5 2/3 since started in late June. So throughout the month of July and into August, he hasn't been able to go more than 5 2/3. He hasn't been efficient pitch-wise at all. His pitch count has been way too high because his walk number has been too high. Since being acquired by Baltimore, his strikeout walk ratio is 5-5 in 9 1/3 innings pitched, allowing 7 earned runs and 13 hits. That's not great, even though, like I said, it was against 2 pretty good offenses. So that's true too. But he wasn't doing that well in the month of July as far as having a 21-10 strikeout walk ratio. That wasn't that impressive either, and 24 hits allowed in 24 innings pitched. So it's a wonder how he didn't allow more runs throughout the month of July. He was keeping opponents to 2 earned runs or less in every start throughout that month, which is kind of odd because based on his stats, his numbers are really not very good and indicate that he should be allowing more runs than that. He's got a 90-51 strikeout walk ratio over the course of the entire season, 13 home runs allowed, 128 hits allowed, and 114 2/3 innings pitched. So he's allowed way more hits than innings pitched. His strikeout rate is low. His walk rate is way too high. Strikeout walk ratio is pretty abysmal. I mean, those stats are just not good, man. And Baltimore, I think, picked him up just so they had a guy who can fill like a last spot in the rotation, basically, because I think they were kind of just missing that. But he's not great. He's got a 4.71 ERA in the course of the season. A 1.56 whip is indicative of his ERA. Should probably be even worse. Those numbers are not good. That is a horrible whip. Putting more than 1.5 base runners on per inning. You can't continue to get away with stuff like that, man, especially facing better offenses where you are now. The Washington's not a better offense, and they're not in his division. But Washington is familiar with him because he was just on Miami and he was just in their division. So I think that puts Rodgers at a bit more of a disadvantage than Irvin is at, even though his numbers against Washington's hitters aren't terrible. They're 24 for 46 off him lifetime with 5 doubles, a home run, 5 RBIs. He does have an 8-1 strikeout walk ratio against them, but that is not really like him in general. It's an average 261 batting average, and 711 OPS. So his stats against Washington are really just in that mediocre range where you can't say that he has the advantage over Washington's hitters or Washington's hitters really have the advantage over him. But Washington's hitters might have at least a little bit more of an edge over him just because they're familiar with him, like I said, because he's been in their division, even though I actually don't think that Rodgers he did face Washington back in mid-June. He actually pitched decently in that game, 7 innings. That was one of his best starts of the season, actually. 7 innings, 6 hits, allowed 2 earned runs, 3-0 strikeout walk ratio. But he had a worse start against them earlier in the season in April. 5 innings pitched, 3 walks, 3 strikeouts, 4 hits, 3 earned runs allowed in that one. So he had one kind of weak start against them and one good start against them. But either way, they've faced him twice this year. Washington, their hitters have much more familiarity than there is on the other side. So all of that and the bad situational spot with the return home spot, that plus the edge that I think you have in the familiarity aspect especially, but I think just in general, the better starting pitcher is on the Washington side. Looking at the market signals here, I do see the market signal. I do see the market signaling on the Washington side here with Baltimore dropping from -177 to -170. I think they're too heavy a favor in a spot like this with a starting pitching matchup like this, man. I don't think it's totally warranted, even though they do have the much better offense. 79% of the tickets are on Baltimore because everybody knows Baltimore's the better team. Public's not going to play Washington in a game like this, despite this starting pitching, what I think is a mismatch. But you do see the cash coming in on the other side on Washington, 59% of the cash on the side of Washington. So a ticket versus cash discrepancy there and some reverse line movement against the public Baltimore team. So I like that. So the way to play this, I think you just fire straight up money line maybe on this. You can get plus 150 on Washington on the money line. And then I think you're just banking on them to have like a 40-something% chance to win the game, basically, which I think is reasonable. So I think they're just being undervalued in the market. Basically, you don't expect them to win every time, but you expect them to just have a better shot at winning than the odds makers are giving them. So you could just do that, or you could take a plus 1.5 run line for half the bet, and you have to pay minus 135 for that. It looks like at best right now. Or no, you can get it at minus 130 right now on that. So you could do half the bet on that and then split it with the other half on the plus 150 money line. So I might consider doing it that way actually as well. I'll have to decide which one I want to do. I can put it in the description, I guess, which one I decide to do there. So one of those two ways would be the way to go there. And then the other play I'm going to have is going to be on the Minnesota Twins. I got two sides here, and this is a spot that I like to look for, man. We're going against the public, even though it does look like we're going against where the cash percentage is right now. But it does look like the line movement is kind of going in my direction here on Minnesota. This is Kansas City against Minnesota. I mentioned I actually kind of leaned in the Minnesota direction yesterday with them just staying at home and Pablo Lopez having the better numbers against Kansas City than Brady Singer did against Minnesota. As good as Singer is, he struggles against Minnesota for some reason, and that continued as Minnesota was able to get to Singer last night, and Lopez had the better of the two starts, which is what I expected. Minnesota won the game. Unfortunately, the one game I actually decided to play was a loser, whereas I did have some leans that wound up being correct last night with Toronto and Minnesota. What can you do? But I like Minnesota again here. I don't think there was that much going on with the game last night as far as like bullpen usage. Neither team used much of their bullpen. Royals used 2 relief pitchers. Twins used 3. The Twins did use a couple of their better relievers, I guess, in Jacks and Blewett. And Blewett did not blow it. But still, I don't think there's a huge edge one way or the other with the bullpens. I think the Twins actually might have the better of the two bullpens in general out of the two teams. So the fact that the Twins used one more reliever than Kansas City did, I don't think it's that much of a disadvantage. It's not going to keep me off of this, really. So, I mean, it's not because I'm going to play this game. So the bullpen situation, I think, is just kind of a wash due to all that. Kansas City, even though they might be looking to bounce back from a loss yesterday, I'm not sure that I see that being the case here with this starting pitching matchup. Although it is Seth Lugo pitching for Kansas City, and he's putting together a really good season, even though he's older. He has shown signs of being a good pitcher in the past, although he is putting together his best season really of his career, except for maybe his relief season with the Mets back in 2019. He had really good numbers, but that wasn't as a starter. So he was a relief pitcher for a lot of his career up until the last 2 seasons really is when he really became a full-time starter for the most part. So he's been a reliever for most of his career. But this season, there's no doubt about the fact that he's put up good numbers. 2.72 ERA, 1.05 whip. All of that's good. He's got a 131, a 37 strikeout walk ratio. That's all good as well. And only 126 hits allowed and 155 2/3 innings pitched. So strikeout rate a little bit low, but a low walk rate and a very low hit rate. So he's not putting many men on base. He's been good overall, man. So I do hesitate to go against him. But he has kind of been alternating good and bad starts. As you can see here, he had a bad start against Boston. But, of course, as I'm going to say, a couple of his bad recent starts were against Boston. He had a decent start against Colorado on the road, which is kind of tough to do, even though Colorado's offense isn't that great. Then he had a second straight road start against Boston. Tough spot and really kind of got lit up hit-wise. And that one gave up 10 hits, which is really unlike him. 6.1 strikeout walk ratio, though. But he was also looking at playing in the All-Star game, so maybe he was distracted for that reason. Pitched in the All-Star game. Then he came out of that and had a complete game, 1-run performance against a weak White Sox offense. Okay, fine. So that was a good start. Then he came out of that and had a bad start against a not great Chicago Cubs lineup at home. So he had a bad start there. Then he had another really good start on the road against Detroit. 8 innings, 1 earned run. So he pitched really well in that one and maybe extended himself again. And then he faced the dreaded Red Sox again, the Dread Sox, and had a bad start in that one again. 6 hits allowed, 4 walks. Kind of unlike him again. The Red Sox kind of just have his number, I guess, man. And he gave up 4 earned runs in that one. So that is what he's coming off of. So that would put him in line for a good start this time. So does that worry me a little bit? A little bit it does, but Minnesota is at least familiar with him. And he has faced Minnesota twice this year and did well. 6 innings in each of those appearances and only allowed 8 hits in those 12 innings pitched and allowed 1 earned run over that entire span. 4 walks, though, to 9 strikeouts. So he did walk too many guys, mostly in that second start. So he was good against Minnesota in those couple of starts. But overall, Minnesota is more familiar with him. And overall, his stats against Minnesota actually aren't good. So even if you factor in those 2 starts that he had against Minnesota's offense this year, somehow his stats against these Minnesota hitters, even including those starts, his stats are still not good against Minnesota over his career. They're 17 for 62 off him lifetime with 3 doubles, 3 home runs, 4 RBIs. He does have a 14-3 strikeout walk ratio against them, which is good. And all 3 of those walks, I guess, were in that second start. No, because he walked 4 against them this year. What am I saying? Maybe one of those hitters that walked just isn't in their lineup anymore. That must be the case. But whatever. Minnesota has a 274 batting average off him right now. This is all Minnesota's current hitters. 274 average, which isn't too bad. And 786 OPS, which is in the a bit higher territory, I would say. So Lugo, even though he has been good overall, his stats against Minnesota are a little bit less good. Minnesota has been able to get to him over the course of their careers in the past. So that's not a great sign for Lugo. So I think Lugo might be a little bit overvalued in the market. And the odds makers are kind of telling you something with the fact that they are lining this game as basically just saying that Kansas City only has a slight edge here, with Minnesota being basically a slight underdog, because they're minus 107, but it's factoring in the juice. So Minnesota has moved from plus 100 to minus 107. So that means we do see market movement on Minnesota. 77% of the tickets are up on Kansas City, so they are public. But what are we seeing here? What was I looking at? 90-something% of the cash, I think, is what I saw on Minnesota. On Kansas City, I lost 91% of the cash. So Kansas City does look like they have the higher cash percentage for now, but the line movement appears to be indicating otherwise and going towards Minnesota. So I think that is the case. The line movement is actually going towards Minnesota. So a little bit of reverse line movement there, actually, against the public Royals. Minnesota, their pitcher is Zebby Matthews. Nobody knows who he is, so the public's going to be on Lugo, who's pitching really well this season. It is the known quantity, but Matthews are getting the much younger pitcher and the completely unfamiliar pitcher. So I think that's an edge to Minnesota here, man, because he is making his major league debut. And you got to look and see who these pitchers are and what they've done in the minors and stuff and what they have for an arsenal before you actually go ahead and do this. But Matthews, I think he is probably the real deal. He is a highly touted prospect. So in that case, I think that bodes well for an offense that is going to be unfamiliar with him, whereas Minnesota is quite familiar with Kansas City. Kansas City is unfamiliar with Matthews. Matthews is making his major league debut. Obviously, he's been kind of rushed through the system because he was pitching so well. His strikeout rate in the minors is actually insane. He has a really high strikeout rate and really low walk rate, including this year. He's been at single A, double A, and triple A, and through all levels of this season, he has 117 strikeouts to only 7 walks. That ratio is absolutely insane. And it's pretty good in AAA, too. It's like 20-1 in AAA or something like that. But in AAA, he does have like a 5 ERA in AAA, whereas in AA and single A this year, his ERA was in the 1s. But because his strikeout walk ratio is still so good in AAA, I think that leads you to believe that he has his stuff and he is still a good pitcher. And he gave up some home runs at AAA, and that just kind of tanked his ERA a bit, and not too many starts in AAA, so that doesn't concern me as much. I think overall his minor league stats are so good. He had like really low ERAs at the other levels. His strikeout walk rate, including at AAA, has been really, really dominant. So that tells me that he does have good stuff, and he's got a 5-pitch arsenal with fastball, cutter, changeup, curveball, slider, I believe. I'm not familiar with how good each one of those individual pitches is. I think he throws like mid-90s on the fastball, but that strikeout walk rate in the minors, that just looks good to me, man. That tells me that I think he is good. He's one of the top pitching prospects in Minnesota's organization, has been moving through the organization quickly because he's been pitching so well. So that's going to do that for me, man. I like Matthews and Minnesota. I like the Minnesota side in this one, even though it does mean going against Lugo. You can get Minnesota minus 105 right now. So those two plays are Minnesota minus 105, Minnesota Twins, and Washington Nationals at either plus 150 or split plus 1.5 at minus 130 on the run line and plus 150 on the money line. And the one thing I will say before I get out of here real quickly is that the Mets also are returning home from a road trip, and they are facing Ross Stripling, who I think actually has good numbers against the Mets over his career, but he is the worst of the two pitchers. So I hesitate to actually fade the Mets there because Stripling is actually not very good overall, even though he does have surprisingly decent numbers against the Mets. Paul Blackburn is pitching for the Mets, though, and that just sets up one of those spots. It's an interesting spot where Blackburn, he's been pretty decent this year, and he is also facing the team that just traded him away. So another one of those interesting spots where Oakland had Blackburn to start the season. They traded him over to the Mets. So Blackburn, I think he was pumped up in his first start with the Mets, and he did pretty well with the Mets because now he's on a contending team, and now he's facing the team that just got rid of him a few starts ago, basically. So I think Blackburn does have reason to be pumped up for that game. So I can't fade the Mets, even though they are returning home from a long road trip. I believe it took them, out to the West Coast. It took them West Coast, Anaheim, then into elevation to Colorado, and then out to the West Coast again to the Mariners. And I faded them in that first game of that series against the Mariners, which was a bad spot. The spot going into Colorado, I think, was probably a bad spot, too, to start that series, because I think they actually had a makeup game in the middle there, too, against St. Louis. So a really crazy road trip, taking them all over the place. And now they're returning home from that. So normally that's a really bad spot for the Mets, but because of the Blackburn scenario and the fact that he might be pumped up against Oakland, and he is the better pitcher over Stripling, I just can't quite do it, even though Stripling does have good numbers against the New York Mets. And the market read on that one, what is it telling me? I don't see the market percentages yet because Oakland hadn't decided on a pitcher when pregame listed these. So that's going to do it for me, man. Minnesota Twins minus 105 and Washington Nationals at either plus 150 or split run line plus 1.5 minus 130 and plus 150 money line. Let's get it done, man. Let's win today. Peace.